the 1970s, the United States government began funding something that sounds impossible. Not weapons, not surveillance technology, but perception. The idea was simple. What if the human mind could be trained to see beyond physical limits? Not metaphorically, literally. To observe locations, objects, even events, without being there. It was called remote viewing. And it wasn't a fringe experiment. It was a program, funded, structured, operated within the intelligence community. For over 2 decades, the project went by multiple names, but it's most commonly known as Project Stargate. And unlike most theories, this one was confirmed. Declassified documents revealed that the CIA and other agencies invested years into testing whether individuals could access information without using their senses. Participants were trained, put through controlled conditions, asked to describe targets they had never seen, locations they had never visited, objects sealed away from any form of contact, and in some cases, the results were difficult to dismiss. Descriptions that matched real-world locations, details that aligned with classified targets, information that, under normal circumstances, shouldn't have been accessible. Skeptics argue that the results were inconsistent, that success rates varied, that some sessions produced nothing, and that's true. But that's not the full picture. Because the program didn't end immediately. It continued for years, which suggests something. Not perfection, but potential. Enough to justify continued funding. Enough to keep it operational. Even within agencies built on measurable outcomes. There were also claims that remote viewing wasn't just used for experiments, but for operations. Locating hostages, tracking movements, gathering intelligence in places that couldn't be physically reached. Some reports suggest it was used during the Cold War, against targets that were otherwise inaccessible. And while many of these claims remain disputed, the program itself does not. It existed, it was funded, and it produced results that were taken seriously enough to continue. Eventually, it was shut down. Officially, the conclusion was that it didn't provide consistent, actionable intelligence, that it wasn't reliable enough for operational use. But that explanation raises a question. If it didn't work, why did it last so long? Why invest decades into something that produced nothing? Unless it didn't produce nothing. Unless it produced something. Just not something that could be easily explained or publicly justified. There's also another possibility, that the program didn't end. It was simply moved, reclassified, shifted into a different structure. Because once a capability is explored, it rarely disappears completely, especially if there's even a chance it works. And that's where the uncertainty remains. Because remote viewing sits in a space between science and something else, something not fully understood, not fully accepted, but not fully dismissed either. Even today, there are individuals who claim the ability still exists, that it can be trained, refined, used outside of government programs, And while many of these claims are met with skepticism, they continue, just like the original program did, which brings it back to a simple question. Not whether every claim is true, but whether something about it was real enough to be taken seriously. Because governments don't typically invest time and resources into ideas that have no foundation at all. They test, they evaluate, and they continue if there's something worth pursuing. Project Stargate may have officially ended, but the idea behind it didn't. That the mind, under certain conditions, might be capable of accessing information beyond what we understand. And if that's even partially true, then the boundaries we assume exist may not be as fixed as we think, because some forms of observation don't rely on distance or presence or even physical reality in the way we define it. And if something like that was ever real, even briefly, then it changes what's possible, not just for intelligence, but for everything. There's also the issue of reliability over distance. Because if information is being perceived remotely, accuracy becomes a factor. Not just whether something is seen, but how clearly, how precisely. Because even small distortions change interpretation, and interpretation is what turns perception into intelligence. Which means results aren't just measured by success, they're measured by consistency, repeatability, whether the same information can be retrieved more than once. And that's where limitations appear, because not all attempts produce the same outcome. Not all sessions align, which creates uncertainty. Then there's the question of filtering, because perception isn't neutral. It passes through the individual, their expectations, their experiences, their biases, which means what is seen may not be purely external. It may be influenced, shaped, adjusted by the person receiving it. And that makes verification difficult, because separating signal from interpretation isn't always clear, which leaves the results in a space between data and perception. And that space is where most of the uncertainty remains. The signal